Hi, once again, I'm Davey, and this is my third video in this first series I'm making, which is on the origins of the most common English words. The first two most common English words, which we already covered, were the and be, and we also covered that, which is another one in the top 10 because it has the same origin as the. And the third most common English word is to, spelled T-O. But it turns out that one of the other two twos, I'm pretty sure there are only three, T-O-O, that is, also has the same origin. T-O and T-O-O both have the same origin, but naturally T-O is a lot more common. That's the only one that's in the top 10. T-W-O is different. So the origin of to, T-O, is from the word toe in Proto-Germanic, because vowels shifted in various Germanic languages, but in English they shifted during the transition from during late Middle English, I think, and early modern English in like the 16th century. There was the Great Vowel Shift, or maybe the 15th century too. Anyway, before that, you would pronounce vowels basically as they're pronounced in other European languages like Latin and I think German too today. Vowels tend to be pronounced pretty much the same. In a lot of languages, they tend to be pronounced the same given a certain spelling. So what I mean is, like, in Romance languages, whenever you see an O by itself, pretty much it's just going to be pronounced O, and an A will be pronounced A. An E would be pronounced A. Typically, I don't know much about German, but I think that's how it is in German. That's certainly how it was in Latin and French and Spanish, and I think that's the role in European languages mostly. But in English, we had a vowel shift after we had started, even though spelling wasn't standardized, until like the early 19th century with people like Daniel Webster. When the great vowel shift happened, there were already spellings that were widely used for certain words that spelled them according to the standard European convention, where A is an A and E is an A. The sound A is written with A, the sound A is written with E, the sound E is written with I, the sound O is written with O. Since that was the way people were typically spelled words. And these spellings of certain, writing existed well before the Great Vowel Shift in like the 16th century. And in English, lots of spellings were already in wide use that made sense according to the old rules. But once vowels shifted, then they stopped making sense according to those rules. So to, before the shift, would have been pronounced toe, but spelled the same, and now it's pronounced to because lots of vowels shifted. Okay, and this is the case for many, many words. Like I said before, although there may have been other factors here, because the vowel in the is unstressed, it was originally pronounced they, with the E being pronounced A, which is how you'd expect that vowel to be pronounced if it were a word in a Romance language or German, but it ended up being pronounced the because the vowel somehow shifted to become the unstressed schwa. Anyway, in the case of to, that's how the vowel shifted, but the word itself comes from that word toe in Proto-Germanic, which was also, I think, ta in other forms, because Proto-Germanic had this, I'm not sure if this is a case of ablaut, but which is a word for one kind of situation where a word changes its vowel depending on whether it's depending on in what context it's being used. Since this is like a preposition, I don't even know if the word declension is the accurate word, but basically somehow or other the word toe in Germanic, which is basically the same as R2, like a preposition used in different situations, changed the vowel depending on that situation, for some of its usages. And then further back in Proto-Indo-European, the word was do, so the D turned into a T. Okay, that was the preposition that to ultimately comes from. Do in Proto-Indo-European, then toe in Proto-Germanic, and then that became the toe in Old English and ended up as being pronounced to today. Anyway, the original meaning of it, as you might guess, is the most literal meaning. That's usually how it happens with words. They start out with a very literal meaning and then can take on abstract meanings later. like we saw with the's sort of an abstract thing. It's a definite article, but originally it had the same origin as that, which is sort of more concrete. When we say that thing, we're pointing to a specific thing, like over there maybe. So the started up being that demonstrative pronoun, and we don't know where that ultimately came from in Proto-Indo-European. It was sort of like a demonstrative pronoun or determiner in Proto-Indo-European too, but it maybe had some concrete origin at some point before that, buried under the sands of time, metaphorically. We don't think there are scrolls under the sand that describe anything before Proto-Indo-European, certainly. With to be, that's the case too. I mentioned that last time the three verbs that came to form to be, but what I didn't say, I think, is that some of them had more, originally in Proto-Indo-European had more literal senses. I forget which was which, but one of them originally had more of a sense of like to live than to be, which you could think is maybe a little more specific. Like you could say, I lived there, and then came to be thought of as just a way of saying to be later. Another example of that is, you might know the literary word in English wend, as in like, I'm wending my way through the traffic to get to the other side, right? Well, its past tense used to be went. Nowadays we just say wended, but its past tense at one point was went, and that became used so much that it became associated with, I guess, the more common verb for going places, go, and went became a past tense of the verb to go. So, and in a sense, you could say that wend is more concrete than going. Going, you could be doing any kind of transporting yourself, in any various ways, but wending suggests a particular kind of way. Okay, so this past tense of a particular way of going, went, came to be the past tense of, the general way of going, the word for just going in general, to go. Its past tense became, instead of goed or whatever it was before, became went. So that's another example of a concrete thing becoming more general, and this happens a lot in the evolution of language. Anyway, in this case, as I was starting to say, but went off on this tangent about how the concrete becomes more general as language evolves. To started out having the meaning, and in Proto-Indo-European certainly, and even in Proto-Germanic, primarily of a physical connection between two things, like motion from one thing to the other, or just a direction from one thing to the other, that very concrete prepositional property, the very concrete physical relationship of one thing being going to another, into or toward or to, as in English today, there were different contexts where we would use this preposition, but that was its original meaning, the very physical meaning. And then it came to take on more abstract meanings, like doing something in order to do something else, so whatever your action is connected to your purpose somehow. And so we have the one major abstract meaning of to in English today is as the first part of an infinitive, which is the form of the verb that you use when there's not a specific, when it's not occurring right after the subject. So if I say, I want to go to the store, then you have to put to before go, right? And there are situations where you can have sort of an infinitive of the verb in English where you don't use to, like, I could go to the store. I think grammatically you might say that go is still in the infinitive there, even though you don't use to, but usually when you have an infinitive in English, you'd use to right before the verb, and that again is a more abstract usage of to that ultimately goes back to the concrete usage, because people would think like, okay, I'm going, and there's a connection between my going and the store, or I'm going, or sorry, if you say like, I'm going to eat now, there's a connection between my going and eating, and and then that connection could be represented by this word to, denoting a physical connection. I'm going to eat, like the going is connected to eating, right? And then this became more abstract, and then we even ended up with the rule sort of artificially imposed, very artificially imposed in fact, by one 19th century, I believe, grammarian, that because in Latin infinitives are just one word, so that they can't be split up with another word in the middle. You shouldn't be able to do that in English either. So then if you think of to go in a sentence, or if you think of like to eat in a sentence like I'm going to eat, or a sentence like I want to eat, if you think of to eat in those sentences as an infinitive and you want it to be like Latin, then you can't put anything in the middle, so you shouldn't be able to say, for example, as the Star Trek monologue, the original Star Trek monologue in the opening theme famously says, you shouldn't be able to say that that we're going to boldly go where no man has gone before, because that splits the infinitive to go by putting boldly in there. And, according to these prescriptivists who promote that rule, you also shouldn't be able to say that it's important to not do that again, because that splits to do, the infinitive to do with the adverb not. But this rule doesn't really have a basis in history, because infinitives would be split before, and actually to was originally just thought of as a preposition connecting the two verbs, the main verb if you say like we're going to eat, the main verb is to go. It's complicated because you're also using that's the present progressive tense or whatever it's called, are going. If you just say we want to eat, then want is the main verb, eat is in the infinitive as a secondary verb. I guess you call want the auxiliary verb. That's what you call it, the auxiliary verb. Even though it's an auxiliary verb, it's a finite verb, and then to eat is in the infinitive. And in that case, originally to would just be thought of as this preposition connecting the wanting and the eating. It would be thought of more physically, and it wouldn't be thought of as inextricably bound to the eating. As like people, the way etymologically to came in there wasn't as like a grammatical modifier. It was originally just thought of as a separate element of the sentence. So originally, people wouldn't have thought it was speaking English back in Old English times, wouldn't have thought it was so weird to split an infinitive, presumably, because I'm not sure that whether this happened in Old English or Middle English, actually, that to became associated with infinitives. But in any case, it was always a separate word. It didn't used to be one word. So, whereas in Latin, infinitives were just one word. Anyway, so to acquired these various abstract meanings. We have all kinds of other abstract meanings of to, right? We talk about someone like coming to, or the total amounting to something. It's used in all these set phrases. They all ultimately go back to they either go back to a time when the phrase was thought of more literally, with to denoting some kind of physical connection, or they're inspired by other phrases, in more recent centuries when, we already have all these abstract phrases with to, and we just coin more by analogy, maybe. Anyway, so to is used in all these phrases today, and one thing I can mention briefly that's maybe interesting is to used to have a meaning of as to. There's apparently an expression that I hadn't heard of before, which is of like taking a woman to wife, which means taking her as your wife, which is something maybe that you'll see in like certain, religious marriage ceremonies. I'm not sure where this would come up, but apparently that's still used as a set phrase. To used to mean as sometimes, because again, it was just thought of as a general connector. Okay, you take a woman as your wife, well then woman, wife are connected. As I said, the other they'll talk about another word too, which is too, because it actually, despite being a different word today, it's funny, there are all these words you have to keep straight, right? Like then and then I mentioned, because they're related to the a couple videos ago. People might use the wrong one, as a misspelling, effectively just misspelling the word, and it's since they basically sound the same, right? You might use the wrong one in your writing and have to have Grammarly or something fix it. But it used to be that they share the same etymology and just ended up with different spellings over time, sort of randomly. they, then and then, as I said, they both originally just denoted like a separation, temporally or physically, a way of contrasting two things. Than and then are both, separative words somehow. This, A then B separates A and B. A then B is a separation between them two, one then the other. So they started out as the same word and then diverged. The same is true with two and two, TOO2 and TO2. TOO2 has basically two meanings today. There's the also meaning, I want that too, me too, and there's the excessive the meaning of excessiveness, as in there are too many candies in the soup. I don't want candies in my soup. Why would you anyway? And those both are sort of the same thing in that they both involve addition. That's the fundamental concept that's common to those, right? Like if you talk about me too, it's like add me to whatever we were talking about. If you say too many of something, then it's like you're adding many of the things. You're adding to however many there already were. Now it's too many, right? Or too much. And like I just said, right, you're adding to the thing. Maybe you could with TO too, right? You could associate the concept of too many with TOO many, with adding to a many that you already have, and then you have too many. So they do that. Too does go back to the same etymology as TO. The metaphor would be the metaphor that was made originally is that if you have too much of something, it's like, you have much and then to that much, there's more. Or if I'm doing something and you want to do it too, then it's like I'm doing it and then you to that thing, I'll add as well, right? So it's basically the idea of adding you to that thing. It's not like the etymology went through the verb add specifically or anything. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that that's basically how it worked, that initially they were like the same word, and it was just another one of the many ways that two can be used to represent various abstract processes. If two TOO is a way connotes addition, and TO is often used to add things to other things. I'm going to come to the party, well then it's adding me to the party, right? So it's just like prepositions can be used, lots of prepositions. It's the same thing with of and by. They can be used in all kinds of these different ways, except of is generally has to do with generation. Something came of another thing. By can just mean really all kinds of things, something sort of moving past something, or also generation. Prepositions can almost just be used in, some prepositions can be used in almost diametrically opposing expressions. Like by, if you get by the guard, it's like you avoid the guard, but you can also go by the bridge, which means you were on the bridge, So prepositions can have almost opposing meanings in different contexts, and two is sort of like that too, in that my point, I'm just saying that to can just have all kinds of different abstract meanings to ultimately go back to a concrete meaning of connection between two things somehow, physical connection. And that's also the case ultimately for TOO too, because that has the same origin. So that's where these basic words TO and TOO came from, ultimately from the concrete sense of two, all these abstract senses of two, and all the senses of TOO too developed, but TWO is separate. Next time we'll talk about whatever the next most common word is, and I believe that is and.